There's a specific kind of silence a movie can leave you with. Not that wow, that was cool, silence, but the I need a second to remember how to breathe, silence. The Furious left me in that space, just watching the credits crawl while my popcorn went completely untouched. This is Bongo Gaming, and today I want to talk about a revenge drama that isn't afraid to get ugly, stay ugly, and then ask you what you're actually cheering for. If you're new here, feel free to hit subscribe if you like hanging out and overthinking violent dramas with me, but no pressure, just vibes. I'll keep the spoilers on the moderate side, we'll talk about the premise, the emotional beats, and some mid-movie turns, but I'm not going to walk you step by step through the ending or the exact fate of everyone involved. The Furious, or Xie Miao, is one of those stories that sounds almost familiar on paper. A quiet tradesman, Wang Wei, has his daughter taken by a human trafficking ring, the system fails him, and he turns into a one-man problem for an entire criminal network. But it's not actually a Taken clone, and it's not really a pure action fantasy either. With Kenji Tanigaki directing, you know the fights are going to snap, but what surprised me is how much the movie leans into hurt, into humiliation, into that very tired, very dangerous place where a man has nothing left except the ability to cause damage. The film doesn't just want you to root for Wang Wei, sometimes it wants to make you flinch from him. We meet Wang Wei as a smallness. That's the choice. Miao Xie plays him not as this secret ex-special forces superhero but as a guy whose body already knows the stiffness of long workdays. You see it in the way he moves in those early scenes, the slight hitch when he squats down, the way he wipes his hands on his pants like he's done that 1,000 times in the exact same spot. The movie lets you feel the routine before it tears it apart. And that's why, when his daughter is kidnapped by a trafficking ring, it doesn't feel like a plot beat. It feels like someone ripped a piece out of a life you already believe in. There's an early moment around the kidnapping that stuck with me, and it's not the actual grab, which is shot with this almost matter-of-fact swiftness. What got me is the half-minute after. The film lingers on Wang Wei arriving late in the way all parents dread, and he walks into this space that should be loud and it just isn't. There's this sound design thing where the ambient city noise muffles, like someone's put a pillow over the world, and you watch him call her name once, twice, trying to keep his voice steady. The camera holds a little too long on his hand as he picks up something small she's dropped, and I swear, I felt my stomach cave in more from that shot than from any of the punches later on. It's a perfect example of how the movie doesn't need melodrama to hit you, it just needs a man and an empty space. What pulls you in early is that Kenji Tanigaki knows restraint is a weapon. For a director known for kinetic violence, he plays the first act almost like a chamber piece. A lot of the pain is in close-up, Miao Xie's eyes, the tension along his jaw when he's trying to stay polite at the police station, the way he forces his shoulders straight even when everyone in that room is basically telling him, there's nothing we can do. You can feel him trying not to scream at people he knows he can't afford to alienate. And in those scenes, the movie is weirdly quiet for something called the Furious. That contrast is the point. What's clever is how early the film starts introducing the idea that this isn't just about one missing child. There are casual details, background conversations, hints of long-standing files buried in drawers. You hear about similar cases in passing. A tired cop glances at another officer before answering Wang Wei's questions, that subtle, don't poke this, body language. It's not spelled out with exposition, but you get it. This is bigger, and the system has already decided it's more convenient to stay blind. That slow dawning, that, oh, they're not incompetent, they're complicit, feeling, is what breaks whatever faith Wang Wei had left in institutions. That's where Naveen comes in, and the movie takes on a different kind of energy the instant Joe Taslim shows up. Naveen's a journalist with his own missing person wound, his wife disappeared while investigating the same trafficking ring. On paper, that's the kind of parallel backstory that could feel lazy, look, they both lost someone, instant bro bonding. But it actually plays out messier than that. Naveen is not the guy who believes in the nobility of the press anymore. He looks tired in a way that's different from Wang Wei's tired. Joe Taslim has this gift for combining physicality with weariness. He can look like he could run through a wall and also like he hasn't slept properly in a year. What I liked is that the film doesn't suddenly flip into buddy cop banter just because these two damaged men share a goal. Their alliance is not cute. It feels like two people holding onto each other, mostly because the alternative is standing alone in a storm. Wang Wei has this raw, almost naive single-mindedness: get my daughter back. Naveen has lived with the unanswered question longer, so his desperation is more controlled, more strategic, but in some ways even darker, because he knows how much can be lost without any resolution. Watching those two forms of obsession collide is one of the film's most compelling threads, and it gives the action sequences a weirdly intimate subtext. Half the time, they are not just fighting traffickers, they are fighting each other's ways of coping. There's a great early meeting between them in a cramped, fluorescent-lit hallway outside some dingy office, and it's shot almost like a standoff. They size each other up, not just as allies, but as potential liabilities. Naveen's asking questions, pushing for details, clearly thinking in structures, networks, leads. Wang Wei is all instinct, all, tell me where they are. You can see the exact moment Naveen realizes, if I don't redirect this guy, he's going to get both of us killed. That little flicker of calculation in Taslim's eyes sells the whole dynamic. He isn't just here to mourn, he's here to outthink a machine that's been outthinking the police. And speaking of machines, the trafficking ring here isn't portrayed as some cartoonish lair with a central boss who monologues. It's more like a web, faceless in the way real systems of exploitation are. Yes, there are recognizable villains and cruel mid-level operators, but what's unsettling is how mundane it looks: back rooms behind legal businesses, boring paperwork that hides devastating crimes, phones that never stop ringing. Enyou, whenever he appears, brings this stillness that makes every scene uncomfortable. He never has to raise his voice, his authority is in what he doesn't say, in how other people rearrange themselves around him. The movie resists giving him some tragic sob story backstory. Sometimes evil is just a man who decided his comfort matters more than other people's survival, and honestly, that's enough. One of the things I really appreciated about The Furious is that it doesn't let the violence become weightless. Kenji Tanigaki's action direction is as sharp as you'd expect, but it's also dirtier, slower, almost clumsy at times in a way that feels very intentional. Wang Wei doesn't suddenly start throwing perfect spinning kicks. His fighting style looks like a lifetime of manual labor turned into a weapon. He shoves, he swings, he grabs whatever's nearby. You can practically feel how his muscles burn after each encounter. The punches don't land with that slick Hollywood whoosh, they are thuds, scrapes, the sound of bone against concrete. Even when the choreography gets more elaborate, it never stops feeling like bodies in actual danger. There's one confrontation in an industrial space, think shadowy corridors, metal walkways, that cold fluorescent hum, where Wang Wei corners one of the lower-level guys tied to the ring. You can hear the guy's shoes skidding on the floor as he backs up, the echo of each step doubling the tension. The camera stays close, almost too close, as Wang Wei presses him against a pillar. And just when you expect a big action beat, the film pauses. Miao Xie's face is inches from this man's, and you watch a storm go through him: rage, fear, confusion, the dawning horror that he is absolutely capable of killing this person right now. The shot lingers long enough that you start to feel complicit, like you're the one deciding whether he crosses that line. When the actual burst of movement comes, it's not pretty. There's no clean hero moment, just messy survival and a man who doesn't quite recognize himself afterward. That, I think, is where The Furious separates itself from a lot of revenge dramas. It constantly interrogates who Wang Wei is becoming. It's not just asking, how far would you go? It's asking, if you go that far, who comes back? And it does that without ever turning into a lecture. It just shows you the aftermaths. The hands that shake. The quiet moments where he avoids looking at his own reflection. The way other people flinch a little when he raises his voice, even if he doesn't mean to. Every fight leaves a mark, and not just on the people he's hitting. At the same time, there's a very real catharsis in watching this man refuse to be swallowed by bureaucracy and corruption. I'm not going to lie, there were scenes where I absolutely wanted him to break teeth. The movie knows that impulse lives in the audience too. And it plays with that. It lets you feel the thrill of someone finally punching back at a system you know is rotten, and then it makes you sit with the cost. That push and pull is what kept me engaged even in slower stretches. I was constantly asking myself whether I was comfortable with what I was rooting for. Naveen, in contrast, gives the movie a more cerebral tension. He's the guy taking photos of documents with shaky hands in badly lit rooms, making calls from payphones, constantly scanning his surroundings. There's a different kind of bravery in him, the bravery of someone who has chosen to live with the question, "What did I miss?" every day. Joe Taslim plays him with this underlying flinch, like he's permanently braced for another bad phone call. He doesn't just want to rescue his wife, he wants to expose the whole network, to make sure this doesn't happen again. That wider mission puts him at odds with Wang Wei's laser focus, and the movie doesn't pretend that tension can be neatly resolved. There's a quietly devastating scene again, avoiding exact plot structure, but it happens somewhere in the middle stretch, where Naveen tries to explain to Wang Wei why going straight for blood might actually play into the cartel's hands. On the surface, it's a tactical argument about leads and information. Underneath, it's about grief philosophy. Naveen's version of love is persistence and documentation, the kind of stubbornness that lives behind spreadsheets and case files. Wang Wei's version is a howl in human form. When those two versions collide, it's not about who's right, it's about how badly each of them needs their way to make sense of what's been taken. Watching the frustration in their faces as they talk past each other is one of the film's quiet highlights. Cinematography-wise, The Furious leans hard into contrast. A lot of the cityscapes are shot in this washed-out palette, all grays and sickly yellows, like the air itself is tired. But then you'll get these sudden pockets of intense color, the warm glow of a workshop lamp over Wang Wei's tools, the harsh red of a sign flickering outside a crime scene, the cold blue of a phone screen lighting up a face in the dark. Those color pops start to feel symbolic, little sparks of life or threat in a world that's otherwise dulled by routine and systemic neglect. It's not flashy in a self-conscious, look at this color grading way, but it's intentional enough that you notice. Kenji Tanigaki also has this very physical sense of space. Fight scenes aren't just choreography, they are geography. You always understand where people are in relation to each other, which is something a surprising number of big-budget action films forget. Doors matter. Corners matter. Elevation matters. There's a stairwell sequence that made me weirdly aware of my own knees because the impact of each stumble and fall is so clear. The camera placement emphasizes how precarious everything is, a misstep means a broken neck, not just a cool tumble. When you combine that with the emotional stakes of the story, it becomes almost exhausting in the best way. Let's talk about the corruption angle. Because that's the spine of the world they are fighting. The film doesn't waste time with one bad apple narratives. The cops aren't all mustache-twirling villains, but the structure they operate in is clearly engineered to look the other way. You see it in the way cases are classified, in the language they use, runaway, misunderstanding, cross-jurisdictional issue. No one has to outright say, "We're on the cartel's payroll," for you to feel the rot. It's in the shrugs. It's in the, "we'll look into it," with no notes taken. That level of institutional complicity is what justifies, emotionally, the extreme measures Wang Wei and Naveen are taking, at least on first glance. This is where I have a slightly contrarian take compared to how I've seen some people talk about the film. I've heard The Furious praised as this pure, righteous roar against corrupt power, kind of burn it all down fantasy. And yes, it absolutely functions on that level if that's what you want from it. But the more I sat with it, the more I felt like the film is almost afraid of that fantasy. It gives you pieces of it, the brutal payback, the defiance, but it undercuts them with collateral damage, with missed chances for actual change, with characters who get so consumed by revenge that they might be doing the cartel's job for them. To me, it's less, burn it all down, and more, if you burn everything, what's left for the people you love to come back to? That ambiguity is going to frustrate viewers who wanted something cleaner, but I think it's what makes the movie linger. There's a specific shot, mid-movie, after a particularly violent encounter. Wang Wei is covered in other people's blood. Not dramatically, not head to toe, but in these messy, practical smears, across his cheek, along his forearms, spattered on his shirt. He's standing alone in a public bathroom, under those awful bright lights that show every flaw, and he tries to wash it off. The camera doesn't look away. You hear the faucet sputter, the squeak of his hands on his own skin. The red doesn't come off clean. It's not just a visual metaphor, it's a small logistical nightmare. That whole sequence runs longer than you expect, and by the end of it, the cool factor of what he just did has evaporated. All that's left is a guy who has to walk back into the world pretending everything is normal while knowing it absolutely isn't. On a more personal note, that scene messed with me. I'm pretty desensitized to screen violence at this point, occupational hazard, but something about watching the cleanup, the mundanity of it, hit harder than the confrontation itself. I think it's because the film forces you to imagine what comes next, the bus rides, the awkward small talk with neighbors, the "have you eaten yet" texts, all layered over what this man now has in his recent memory. It's one of the few times I caught myself literally leaning back from the screen like, yeah, okay, maybe we don't want him to go any further than this. I think a lot of people will have their own personal, too far, moment with this film. That was mine. On the flip side, I have to admit, whenever Joe Taslim's Naveen gets to move, another part of my brain lights up entirely. This is a guy whose body language is usually all tight coils and suppressed urgency, so when he finally snaps into action, it feels like a rubber band breaking. There's a chase sequence where he's not just running after someone, he's navigating this maze of back alleys and half-finished buildings, and you can see his investigative brain working even as he's sprinting. He's not just fast, he's observant mid-motion, catching details, predicting turns. That combination of athleticism and intelligence is one of Taslim's particular strengths, and the film uses it well to contrast with Wang Wei's more brute force approach. One small, slightly funny aside I noticed: The Furious occasionally flirts with that action movie thing where our leads take absurd amounts of punishment and then keep going, but it mostly pulls back from full-on superhero territory. Still, there's this one moment where Wang Wei and Naveen both get knocked down, hard, and then 10 seconds later they are back on their feet arguing strategy. I remember thinking, sir, your ribs are lying. It doesn't break the film's realism, but it's one of the few times I wanted someone to just sit down, ice their bruises, and Google trauma therapist near me. Sound design is another quiet MVP here. The movie knows when to isolate a sound and let it haunt you. A phone ringing in an empty room. The metallic clack of a shutter closing on a storage container. A child's laughter in a memory that cuts off abruptly. The score itself stays pretty restrained. There are no swelling orchestras telling you when to cry, but there are these simple motifs that follow certain emotions around, a few piano notes that show up whenever Wang Wei is on the verge of breaking, a low percussive rumble whenever the cartel's presence is near even if they are off-screen. You don't consciously track it at first, but by the time you're in the second half, you start getting nervous just hearing that little bass line fade in. What's particularly effective is how often the film drops the music out entirely during confrontations. It trusts the creak of floorboards, the catching of breath, the scrape of a chair being dragged, to create tension. That kind of sonic minimalism can be risky, especially if the performances can't carry it, but here it works. Miao Xie's breathing alone in some scenes feels like a whole monologue. You can hear his heartbeat in the way his chest rises and falls after a fight. When you pair that with Kenji Tanigaki's instinct for when to cut and when to let a shot run long, you get this really tactile sense of fear and exhaustion. Editing-wise, The Furious walks an interesting line. The action is tight, with cuts that emphasize impact without getting choppy. But the dramatic scenes are allowed to breathe, sometimes to a degree that people with shorter patience might call slow. Personally, I liked that the movie wasn't trying to be a constant highlight reel. You get long takes of people talking, waiting, thinking. There's a stretch in the middle where the story almost deliberately loses momentum because Wang Wei and Naveen hit dead ends, and you feel that futility as a viewer. I can imagine some folks checking their phones during those sequences. But I'd argue they are essential. If the hunt felt smooth, the subject matter would feel dishonest. Let's talk about Enyou for a second, because while I won't pin down exactly who he plays in the machinery of the plot, his screen presence is one of the more unnerving ingredients in this thing. He has this watchful, slightly detached energy that makes every interaction feel like an evaluation. There's a scene where he just sits, listening to someone report in, and the way he tilts his head, the way his eyes flick to tiny details in the room, tells you more than any line of dialogue could. You get the sense that here is a man who has compartmentalized so aggressively that nothing really touches him directly anymore. He's not a mustache-twirling villain, he's a man who made 1,000 small compromises until there was nothing left but cold. Thematically, that's actually one of the film's sharper points. Rage is loud, but complicity is quiet. Wang Wei is the explosion you can't ignore. Naveen is the slow-burning fuse. The traffickers, the corrupt officials, they are almost serene in their evil. They sign things. They call people. They drink coffee. They don't rant about power or monologue about fate, they just do their jobs, and their jobs happen to be monstrous. That banality makes the violence of the protagonists both more understandable and more alarming. When evil looks boring, we crave someone who looks like an avenging angel. The Furious seems very aware of that psychological loop. At some point in the midsection, the film starts to broaden its focus from just Wang Wei and Naveen's personal quests to the ecosystem that allows the trafficking ring to operate. Again, I'm not going into exact plot mechanics, but you start seeing how poverty, migration, and bureaucracy intersect. There are parents apart from Wang Wei who've lost children and have learned the hard way that no one is coming. There are workers on the edges of legality, easy to threaten and easier to disappear. None of this is hammered on with speeches, it's more in the casting, the locations, the snippets of overheard conversation. It's like the movie is saying, this isn't just one story. It's one we happen to follow. And that's where I think some people might underestimate just how political this movie is under its genre coating. On the surface, it's a personal vengeance tale. Underneath, it's an indictment of what happens when poor people and their kids are treated as expendable logistics problems. The cops here aren't failing because they're individually weak, they are failing because the entire system prioritizes stability and appearance over justice. Media, too, gets a complicated treatment. Naveen is a journalist, yes, but he's also someone whose work potentially put his loved one at risk. The film never fully answers whether the exposure he's chasing can actually move the needle against the forces he's facing, and that uncertainty is one of the movie's braver choices. There's a quieter thread running under all of this about masculinity. Two men, two different ways of dealing with loss, both choking on expectations of what a good man and a good protector is supposed to do. Wang Wei's journey is steeped in that traditional, almost primal idea that a father must be able to physically shield his family. When that's ripped away, all he has left is the ability to break things. Naveen, meanwhile, is wrestling with a more modern pressure. If you uncover the truth, if you document everything, maybe that makes the suffering worth it. Both are carrying not just their grief but their guilt, their sense that they failed. The Furious doesn't sit them down to talk about it in neat therapy language, but you feel it in every risk they take. I want to point out a small performance detail from Xie that I really loved. Throughout the film, whenever Wang Wei has to interact with authority figures, police, bureaucrats, people above his pay grade, he has this reflexive half-bow, half-nod thing he does. It's quick, almost instinctual, this gesture of deference carved into his body language. As the story goes on, and he gets deeper into the cartel's world, that physical habit starts to disappear around certain people. There's a moment later on where someone tries to talk down to him and he just doesn't nod. It's nothing, technically. But if you've been watching him closely, it feels like an earthquake. His relationship to power has changed, and cost is written all over his face. On the writing side, Tin Shu Mak, Qilong Lei, and Quan Sin Shum keep the dialogue pretty stripped down. This isn't a quippy script. Jokes, when they show up, are dry and edged with bitterness. Most of the really important exchanges happen in half sentences, in what isn't said. I appreciated that. There's this temptation in stories like this to have characters speechify about justice and family, to give you those neat monologues that can be cut into trailer sound bites. The Furious mostly refuses that. It lets people be inarticulate in their pain, which feels closer to how trauma actually sounds. That said, there are a couple of slightly on-the-nose lines that pulled me out for a second, the kind of, you don't understand what it's like to lose a child, stuff that we've all heard before. They are not constant, but when they do pop up, they clang a little against the film's otherwise grounded tone. For the most part, though, the writing trusts silence, facial expressions, and physical actions to carry meaning. Kenji Tanigaki's direction is in sync with that. He knows when to just sit on a reaction shot and let an actor earn their paycheck. Somewhere around the midpoint, Wang Wei and Naveen's partnership hits a major fracture point. Again, not going into the exact trigger, but it's tied to a decision about information versus immediate action. The fallout from that rift gives both actors room to stretch. Joe Taslim gets to let some of Naveen's carefully caged anger slip the leash, and he does exasperation really well, that exhausted fury of someone who has tried to be reasonable and is done being ignored. Xie, on the other hand, taps into a very raw, almost childlike hurt. For a moment, you see the father, not the avenger, a man who just wanted to fix a specific wrong and now feels betrayed by the only person he thought was on his side. From a structural point of view, that conflict is crucial because it stops the movie from becoming a straight-line march through henchmen to the big bad. It reminds you that these are people, not just vengeance robots. Their alliance was always precarious, built on overlapping needs more than mutual understanding, and watching it strain under pressure adds another layer of suspense, not just, will they rescue their loved ones, but, will they even be able to stand next to each other by the time they get close? As the story pushes into its later stages, the violence escalates, as you'd expect, but so does the moral fog. The line between necessary and excessive bloodshed gets harder to parse, and the film mostly leans into that discomfort instead of trying to tidy it up. One thing I think is going to divide audiences is how unwilling the Furious is to give you a fully clean victory. Even without talking about the specific outcome, you can already feel, well before the ending, that some things can't be put back. That awareness hangs over the second half like smoke. And that's probably a good place to pause for a second, because the way the film handles that final stretch, the come what may energy, the toll it takes on everyone involved, and how Kenji Tanigaki chooses to frame the last bursts of violence is where a lot of my stronger opinions kick in. The late-run energy of the Furious shifts from this tight, investigative anxiety into something closer to siege mentality. You can feel it in how the camera starts to move. Earlier, it's often watching from a distance, letting you scan the frame for danger. Now it pushes in, tracks tightly behind shoulders, breathes down necks. Rooms feel smaller even when the spaces are technically bigger. It's like the film is visually admitting that there's no safe ground left, no civic space that isn't at least partially contaminated by the cartel's reach or by the protagonist's own choices. One of the more fascinating choices Kenji Tanigaki makes is how he handles escalation. In a lot of revenge dramas, the final third is where we suddenly discover our protagonists have become unstoppable murder machines, and any sense of vulnerability floats off into the rafters. Here, the opposite happens. Yes, Wang Wei and Naveen get better at navigating this underworld, they understand the patterns, the players, the angles. But their bodies are breaking down. You see the bruises accumulating, the stiffness in each movement, the micro-wince every time someone grabs an arm that's already taken too much strain. There's a late encounter where Wang Wei has to climb something, not even a huge climb, just enough to matter, and you can almost feel his joints protesting. He does it because there's no other choice, but the camera doesn't hide how difficult it is. That physical deterioration is crucial, because it reshapes the tone of the fights. They stop being cool set pieces, and start feeling like last-ditch scrambles for survival. There's a hallway brawl where, earlier in the film, maybe Wang Wei would have powered through with raw adrenaline. Here, he's slower, sloppier, making tiny mistakes that nearly get him killed. The choreography leans into exhaustion, grips that slip because of sweat, feet that don't quite land right, punches thrown a fraction too late. Naveen, too, starts to fray. His normally precise, tactical brain is lagging behind the chaos by a second or two, and you can see the frustration in his face every time he realizes he missed something he would have caught if he weren't so worn down. What's sneaky is how, as their bodies weaken, their moral positions also lose clarity. Early in the film, Wang Wei has specific lines he won't cross, at least in theory. You can see him recoil at certain ideas, push back when Naveen suggests methods that feel too ruthless. By the time you're deep into the third act, those lines have blurred into something more like, whatever gets us closer to them. But the movie doesn't frame that as cool moral hardening or some grimdark glow-up. It makes it look like erosion. There's a moment when he does something he would not have done an hour of screen time earlier, and instead of feeling triumphant, the film gives you a tiny, almost throwaway shot of his face immediately after. He looks lost. Victorious in the moment, maybe, but lost. Naveen has his own version of that shift, but it goes in a slightly different direction. While Wang Wei slides toward raw brutality, Naveen starts to see, with increasing painful clarity, how thin the victory might be even if they succeed. You get glimpses of him looking at the notes he's been compiling, the recordings, the names, weighing the power of exposing this ring against the personal cost of every step closer. There's a subtle pulling away in him, not from the mission, but from the idea that anything they're doing could still be seen as purely just. Joe Taslim plays that dawning cynicism with this gentle, almost weary sadness. He doesn't have some big, "I don't know who we are anymore" speech. He just quiets down, and the silence hits harder than any monologue could. The film's pacing in this stretch is going to be controversial, I can feel it. Right when you expect it to sprint toward the finish line, it throws in these dense little pockets of stillness. A stakeout that feels too long. A silent car ride after something terrible happens. A phone call that doesn't go the way anyone wanted. You almost want to yell at the screen, "Move, move, you don't have time." But that agitation is part of the design. The Furious is very interested in the emotional hangtime between actions, the remorse and second-guessing that happens in that empty space where other movies would cut away. If you're still locked in with the movie at this point, those quiet beats can feel suffocating in the best way. If you're not, they can feel like dead air, and I get that. There were one or two moments where even I, who loves a good slow burn, glanced at the progress bar like, we're really sitting in this, huh? But on reflection, a lot of those pauses end up being the scenes that echo afterward, because they are where the film's thesis really lives. Not in the gunshots, but in the way hands won't stop shaking after the gunshots. There's one late-night scene I keep replaying in my head where Wang Wei and Naveen share a cramped, borrowed room, grabbing a few hours of rest before whatever fresh hell comes next. It's dark, lit only by a flickering street lamp leaking in through grimy curtains. They're not talking strategy. They're not even really talking about their missing loved ones. They are sitting on opposite sides of the room dealing with their own thoughts. Wang Wei is at the edge of the bed, shoulders hunched, fingers worrying some small object, a trinket, a tool. The movie doesn't make it obvious. Naveen is on the floor, back against the wall, staring at the ceiling. The camera moves between them in slow and hurried pans, like it's giving each of them equal weight in this shared silence. Eventually, one of them says something simple, almost mundane, like asking if the other is hungry. It's an absurd question in context, but it cracks something open. They share food that doesn't taste like anything, and that weirdly banal act of care in the middle of a war zone of their own making is more intimate than any dramatic confession could have been. Moments like that are why the alliance between these two feels less like a plot convenience and more like a fragile, living organism. By this point in the story, they've hurt each other, saved each other, blamed each other. Trust isn't a straight line, it's a waveform. And the film really leans into that waveform in the final stages. There are decisions that require them to gamble on each other's priorities. Will Wang Wei choose vengeance over intel? Will Naveen choose the story over immediate rescue? The tension in those choices is less, what will happen, and more, who are these men now? Visually, the last act gets darker, literally. We move deeper into shadowy interiors, underground spaces, rooms lit by single overhead bulbs. The Furious never turns into full horror, but there's a claustrophobic dread in these environments that nudges the movie right up to that threshold. Doorways frame characters like they are already in cells. Corridors stretch out in a way that makes every step feel like voluntarily entering a trap. It's not just that the cartel spaces are ominous, it's that they're depressingly functional. No ritualistic villain decor, just concrete, metal, and the occasional attempt at hominess that makes everything worse. Kenji Tanigaki uses POV in some really effective ways here. There are sequences shot from slightly lower angles, as if we're looking from the perspective of someone smaller, more vulnerable. You feel each doorway as too big, each figure towering. It's a subtle trick that keeps reminding you why this fight started in the first place, without hammering you with flashbacks or heavy-handed dialogue. You're seeing the danger through the lens of the people who've been taken, even when they are not on screen. This is also where Enyou Yang's presence ramps up. Again, I won't spoil the exact configuration of players in the endgame, but whenever his character steps into a frame in this final stretch, the air seems to thin out. He moves slowly, like a man who's never had to rush a day in his life because the world rearranges itself for him. There is a moment, just a small exchange in a crowded room, where he looks at Wang Wei, really looks, and you can see a silent calculation taking place. Is this man a nuisance, a potential asset, or a symbol that needs to be broken? The way Enyou Yang layers that kind of cold assessment under an otherwise neutral expression is chilling. Sound, again, goes minimalist. You'd think the climax of an action revenge film would be all thunderous drums and orchestral peaks, but the Furious pulls back instead. You get these long stretches where the only sounds are footsteps, breathing, the distant hum of some unseen generator. Then, when violence erupts, it's jarringly loud, gunshots without cinematic reverb, scuffles that sound like what they are, messy collisions of flesh and bone. There's one instance where a single scream echoes just a beat longer than you expect before cutting off, and it lands like a punch to the neck. The choice to avoid music during that scream is honestly braver than any fight choreography in the movie. As the protagonists push deeper into enemy spaces, the film also starts to fold back on previous locations and images. You recognize hallways, doors, even specific pieces of furniture, but they look different in this context, more sinister, or more pathetic, depending on how much power has shifted. That repetition creates a sense of circularity, like no matter how far they've come, they are still trapped in the same underlying structures. It's a clever way of saying, you can cut the head off this thing, but the building remains. I'm dancing around specifics, but there's a revelation, not one big twist, more like a harsh clarification about the scale of the trafficking network and the kind of people who benefit from it. It's not just street-level thugs and one shadowy boss. It's logistics companies, data handlers, mid-tier professionals who never get their hands physically dirty. The movie doesn't stop to map every connection, but it shows you enough to make it clear, even if Wang Wei and Naveen torch one section of this web, the rest will keep humming along unless something systemic changes. That awareness hangs over every victory in the final act, making it bitter even when it's satisfying. And this is where I want to circle back to my earlier contrarian angle, because how you read the ending tones of the Furious kind of depends on what you went in craving. If you wanted a blood-soaked parable about how righteous rage can tear down corruption, I think this film might feel frustratingly unresolved. A lot of the bodies that hit the ground in the climax are mid-level scum, not architects. The people who make the real money off suffering tend to be several steps removed, and they are not all lined up in a neat hallway waiting to be punished. If, however, you went in curious about what revenge actually gives back to those who've lost the most, this murkiness hits in a different way. The movie seems much more interested in what Wang Wei and Naveen will have to live with if they survive, rather than whether they won. Performance-wise, the late stages are where Miao Xie and Zhou Taslim do some of their most precise work. Miao Xie's face, by the end, looks like it's aged years in a few days. There's a particular shot where someone asks him a question, a fairly simple one, and you see him consciously reach for the part of himself that used to answer such things easily. It takes him a second too long, like rifling through a drawer that's been emptied out. That beat communicated so cleanly that even if he gets what he's fighting for, the guy who goes home isn't the same one who left. Zhou Taslim, on the other hand, gets a few moments of near stillness where all the angular, practical parts of Naveen fall away and you just see raw grief. One of them involves a recording, "I'll stay vague," and the way he listens, barely moving, is quietly devastating. No sobbing, no shout of agony, just this micro-quiver in his jaw and a blink that takes half a second longer than normal, as if his body is buffering the pain before it registers fully. It's a perfect example of a performer trusting the camera and the audience to lean in rather than demanding attention with theatrics. If I have a gripe about the final stretch, it's that there are one or two character beats that feel slightly undermotivated, especially for some of the side players. A minor character makes a choice that's clearly meant to underline how deep the rock goes, but because we haven't spent quite enough time with them, it lands more as a plot necessity than a truly earned betrayal. In a story this focused on two central figures, it's understandable that some of the orbiting satellites get less nuance, but there were moments where I wished the script had given just a little more texture to the people caught between the cartel and the protagonists. Still, the atmosphere of the ending is strong enough that those minor quibbles don't derail it. The Furious doesn't give you a fireworks finale, it gives you a slow-motion car crash you can't look away from. Even the way the last big confrontations are staged feels more like inevitability than triumph. Hallways that were tense before now feel like corridors in a hospital after bad news. Everything is too bright, too small, too full of echoes. It's not about whether someone lands the perfect punch, it's about whether there will be anything left in them when the dust settles. There's also a subtle but important thread in the final sections about witnesses. Who sees what happens? Who chooses to record, to look away, to step in? In a story so steeped in missing people and institutional indifference, the act of simply being present and acknowledging what's in front of you starts to feel radical. A bystander catching a glance, a kid looking through a crack in a door, a phone camera held down at someone's side. These little visual motifs underline the idea that what keeps systems like this alive is not just active cruelty, but collective refusal to look. The movie doesn't hammer that point home with a speech, but the imagery is persistent. I also want to mention how the color palette, which had been relatively restrained and grim, shifts very subtly towards something else in the closing minutes. Not bright, not hopeful exactly, but there are a few frames where natural light actually feels like natural light again instead of some sickly, corrupted version. It's almost like the film is acknowledging that the world continues beyond these events, that there is still sky and weather and time passing, even if the characters feel frozen in their trauma. Those shots don't promise healing. They just assert that the possibility of something other than this nightmare exists. One aspect I haven't touched on much is how the Furious handles the missing women and children themselves. Given the subject matter, there's a real risk of turning them into props, motivators for the male characters with no inner life of their own. The film isn't perfect on this front, but it does try harder than some of its peers. You get glimpses into the daughter's personality before she's taken, small habits, in jokes with her father, little rebellions. Naveen's wife, too, is framed not just as the journalist's missing spouse, but as a professional in her own right, someone whose investigation set all of this in motion. Their absence is shaped with enough specificity that when the story talks about getting them back, it doesn't feel generic. You remember who them is. At the same time, the movie deliberately leaves some blanks around their current condition, what they've been through. That's a tricky balance. On one hand, not showing explicit suffering avoids turning the film into trauma porn. On the other, the void can feel almost too carefully managed. You know terrible things are happening, but you mostly experience that knowledge through the eyes of men on the outside, not from within the horror. Some viewers will find that merciful, others may feel like the story is still ultimately more interested in the emotional arcs of its male leads than in the lived realities of those they are trying to rescue. I'm of two minds about it. I appreciate the restraint, but I also think the film could have afforded a few more glimpses of these women and children as active agents in their own story, even in captivity. Still, the decision to keep most of the explicit brutality off-screen or implied is not cowardice. If anything, it increases the dread. Suggestion lets your brain conjure things that might be worse than anything shown directly. There's a late scene where someone opens a door and the camera stays on their face, not what's behind it. The sound design does the rest. Watching their expression collapse is, in a weird way, more harrowing than a clear view of whatever's inside would have been. It trusts the audience to understand, and that trust is part of what makes the film feel like it respects the subject matter. On a craft level, I want to shout out the stunt team and the way Tanigaki shoots them. There's this tendency in some action films to turn every background baddie into interchangeable ragdolls. Here, even the nameless goons feel like distinct bodies. You notice the different ways they move, the hesitation in some, the overconfidence in others. During one close-quarters fight, a thug slips in a pool of something on the floor and goes down awkwardly. The camera doesn't hide it or cut away. It incorporates the stumble into the rhythm of the scene. Those kinds of imperfections give the action a lived-in quality, as if you're watching real people with varying skill levels collide, not just motion-captured archetypes. Editing in the penultimate sequence is also particularly sharp. The cross-cutting between simultaneous efforts, investigative, physical, emotional, gradually tightens until you feel like time itself is constricting. Shots get shorter, but not in that disorienting, we hit bad choreography with fast cuts way. Instead, the rhythm accelerates in lockstep with your heartbeat. Then, when something truly terrible or significant happens, the film slams on the brakes and lets you sit in a long take that feels almost punishing. That modulation of pace is one of the reasons the third act, though heavy, never quite tips into exhaustion for me. Now, I should probably confess something about my own viewing experience before we push into talking about how the film lands as a whole. There was a point, somewhere late in the movie, when the bodies started really piling up and the moral calculus got foggy, when I realized my fists were clenched so hard my nails were digging little half-moons into my palms. I actually had to consciously tell myself, relax, it's a movie. That doesn't happen to me often anymore. I watch a lot of this stuff. But the Furious, in its ugliest moments, wormed past my critical distance. I found myself oscillating between wanting these guys to burn the whole network down and wanting to grab them both by the shoulders and say, please, just stop before there's nothing left of you. I think that interior conflict is precisely what the film is going for. It wants you complicit in the bloodlust, then embarrassed by it, then sympathetic to it again. It's not using violence as just spectacle, it's using it as a mirror for whatever anger you came into the theater carrying. And around that late stage, when every decision feels like a lose-lose, you start to see your own frustrations reflected back. You think about the news reports you've read about real-world trafficking, the times you've shaken your head and moved on because the scale felt too big. The movie doesn't pretend that one furious man and one wounded journalist can fix that. It just asks, if you couldn't stand it one day and snapped, what would that actually do? Who would it really help? That's a question that lingers well after the credits start, and it's one I want to sit with a bit more before I talk about how successful I think the movie is overall. Because beyond the punches, the grime, the high-stakes rescues, The Furious is fundamentally about two people trying to grab something human out of a machine built to erase them. Whether it fully pulls that off is a bigger conversation, and that's where I want to go next. What makes that question hit harder is how stubbornly the Furious clings to small, ordinary human gestures even as the body count rises. There are tiny, almost throwaway moments sprinkled throughout that remind you what everyone is actually fighting for. The way Wang Wei instinctively reaches out to steady an elderly stranger on the bus, even when his own head is somewhere else entirely. The way Naveen absent-mindedly adjusts a crooked picture frame in a hallway as he rushes past, some tiny echo of the meticulous man he used to be. The movie seems obsessed with the mundane, as if to say, this is what's being threatened. It's not grand ideals in the abstract, it's the quiet capacity for kindness under all the fear. And that's where I think the film partially wins and partially trips over itself. On one level, it absolutely captures how grief and rage can turn good intentions into a wrecking ball. You watch the humanity leak out of these guys in real time, and when they manage to claw bits of it back in fleeting moments, it feels genuinely moving. On another level, the story occasionally becomes so tightly bound to their subjective tunnel vision that the rest of the world blurs a little. There are hints of other families, other victims, other potential paths to justice, but they are mostly glimpsed at the edges of the frame. The Furious is most powerful when it taps into the idea of a collective wound. It's a bit less convincing when it narrows down to a pure two-man crusade. I don't think that's entirely a flaw, though. There's something revealing in the way the film lets its protagonists believe, or at least cling to the hope, that their personal crusade can serve as a stand-in for a broader reckoning. It's a very human delusion. If I just push hard enough, if I sacrifice enough, maybe the universe will notice. Maybe the system will tremble. The movie's refusal to fully affirm that fantasy, while still investing emotionally in their attempts, is part of what makes it feel more honest than your standard power trip thriller. Stick with me here, because this is where the film starts to feel less like a revenge story and more like a kind of twisted spiritual crisis. Wang Wei is not just fighting criminals, he's fighting the unbearable idea that the world is indifferent to his daughter. Naveen is not just hunting down leads, he's fighting the unbearable idea that his life's work didn't matter and might have made things worse. That's theological level angst, even if nobody in the movie ever talks about it in religious terms. When you watch them rage against the cartel, you're also watching them rage against randomness, against the notion that there might not be a pattern or a moral center to any of this. That's why some of the most affecting shots in the film have nothing to do with violence at all. A static frame of a city intersection where life just goes on, cars stopping and starting, people crossing the street, lights changing. We've just seen something awful happen around the corner, and here's the rest of the city, oblivious. That's a cliché in lesser hands, but Tanigaki shoots it with such patience that it doesn't feel like a cheap contrast. It feels like a thesis statement. The machine rolls on, regardless of who's been broken under it today. Tonally, this puts The Furious in an interesting place. It's too grounded and sorrowful to function as pure catharsis, but it's also way too brutal and kinetic to be some detached art house meditation on suffering. It lives in that uncomfortable middle zone where you're allowed to thrill at what's happening on screen and then immediately wonder what that says about you. I kind of love that space. Films like The Raid, for example, embrace the rush and the spectacle. They are operatic in their violence. The Furious feels more like someone smashed a thriller into a bruised character study and refused to clean up the mess. I should also mention how cultural texture quietly shapes the story. Even without getting deep into specific locations or political history, you can feel the weight of bureaucracy, class stratification, and unspoken social rules pressing on these characters. Wang Wei is the kind of guy who apologizes even while he's being dismissed. That impulse doesn't come out of nowhere, it comes from a lifetime of being told where he sits in the hierarchy. So when he finally stops apologizing and starts demanding, it's not just a genre beat, it's a cultural one, a man at the bottom of the ladder deciding he doesn't recognize the ladder anymore. Naveen, meanwhile, occupies this liminal social space. As a journalist, he's close enough to power to see how it operates, but far enough to be expendable. He can get into rooms Wang Wei can't, but he can also be shut out of conversations that really matter. That sense of proximity without true access fuels a lot of his bitterness. He knows how the story of this trafficking ring would be told in headlines, how it would be spun, how quickly it would be swallowed by the next scandal. So when he chooses to put himself on the line physically, it's not just about his wife, it's also a kind of revolt against the limits of his profession. There's a scene, framed very simply, where Naveen tries to pitch the importance of this story to a fellow journalist or editor. The person on the other side of the desk isn't a cartoon villain, they are just tired. They talk about resource constraints, public attention spans, editorial priorities. Joe Taslim plays Naveen as someone who has had this conversation 100 times, but this time, with his wife missing and the case with his own name etched deep into it, it lands like a slap instead of an inconvenience. Moments like that ground the movie's outrage in real-world frustration. It's not screaming at faceless evil, it's quietly indicting institutional fatigue and cowardice. What keeps the script from becoming a black hole of despair is the way it occasionally lets in these shy little flickers of humor. And I do mean flickers, don't expect Marvel-style quipping. It's more that there are a few dry, almost accidental jokes that feel like they could only be made by people deep in the trenches together. A muttered complaint about terrible instant noodles during a stakeout. A shared look when an interrogated thug gives an obviously ridiculous lie. These aren't laugh out loud moments so much as brief exhale through the nose releases, the kind you get when the pressure is so high that any tiny absurdity suddenly becomes funny. There's one bit in particular that got me, just because it felt so human. Wang Wei and Naveen are trying to follow what they think is a crucial lead, and it leads them nowhere. Dead end. Completely useless. They've risked a lot to get there, and for a split second, the way they look at each other is so deflated it's almost comedic. Wang Wei mutters something under his breath that's basically the equivalent of, all this for nothing, and Naveen, after a beat, just lets out this disbelieving half-laugh. It's not actually funny, but it's what your body does when it's too tired to cry again. That burnt-out humor threads through the later parts of the film like a stubborn weed in cracked concrete. I want to zoom back out for a second and talk about Kenji Tanigaki as a director here, because if you know his work primarily from second unit action direction and fight coordination, what he's doing in The Furious is quietly impressive. You can feel his action roots in every punch, sure, but he's also clearly thinking about how those punches sit inside a larger emotional architecture. His camera rarely fetishizes violence, it observes it. When someone gets hurt, we usually see the aftermath, not just the moment of impact. Limbs don't snap into place easily, faces don't magically UN swollen between scenes. That continuity of damage is something a lot of action directors don't bother with, and it makes a huge difference in how grounded this world feels. At the same time, he's not afraid of stylization when it serves a purpose. There are a handful of shots where reality seems to tilt just a little, where the visuals slip into a slightly heightened space, Not full hallucination, but impressionistic. A corridor that seems longer than it should be, a crowd that seems to blur into a mass of anonymous faces as Wang Wei shoves through them, reflection in a window that lingers a half-second after he's moved away. These touches are never over-explained, but they give you a sense of how dislocated these characters' inner worlds have become. If you're the kind of viewer who watches dramas with an eye on structure, you'll probably notice that The Furious follows a pretty classic three-act spine, but with a saggy, deliberately disorienting middle. That midsection is where some people are going to feel the pacing wobble, but personally, I think it's doing something thematically interesting. The frantic clarity of the first and final acts is bracketed around a messy, searching middle where leads go nowhere, alliances strain, and both men start to question their own assumptions. It mirrors the real rhythm of a desperate search, rush, stall, rush, crash. One of the more intriguing undercurrents in that middle zone is how each man responds when the possibility of failure starts to feel real. Wang Wei clenches harder, becomes more unilateral, more willing to risk catastrophe for a shot at a breakthrough. Naveen gets colder, more analytical, almost retreating into his reporter brain like it's armor. The push-pull between those responses keeps the film from slipping into monotony. Just when you think you know how they're going to tackle the next obstacle, one of them makes a call that complicates the other's plan, and vice versa. Here's something I haven't heard many people talk about, but it really colored how I read the movie. The Furious is quietly obsessed with hands. Not just fists, but hands in all their uses. Working hands, pleading hands, hands that sign documents, hands that hold onto the back of a shirt in a crowd. The camera rests on them a lot. When Wang Wei is in his workshop at the very beginning, we see close-ups of his fingers running along wood, testing edges, measuring. Later, those same hands are blooded, shaking as they grip improvised weapons. Naveen's hands, initially, are always holding something informational: pens, phones, recorders. As he's dragged deeper into the physical side of the fight, you start to see his knuckles split, his fingers cramp. There's something almost poetic in the way the film traces this journey from hands that build or document to hands that destroy. That focus on physicality extends beyond the leads. Think about the officials who sign off on ignoring cases, the lazy, practiced motion of a pen, the disinterested flip of a folder. Or the traffickers who count money with brisk precision, their thumbs flicking through bills. The movie doesn't underline this motif explicitly, but if you clock it, it becomes a kind of visual shorthand for moral choices. What are these hands doing? Who are they touching, helping, hurting? It's a clever way to tie the individual arcs to the broader social canvas without heavy dialogue. And let's talk briefly about the kids in the film, because even in the limited screen time they get, they are portrayed with more specificity than you might expect. You see their boredom in waiting rooms, their fascination with tiny gadgets, their instinct to cling to grown-ups they trust. They are not all angelic victims, they are sometimes bratty, sometimes distractible, sometimes annoying, in other words, actual children. That makes the stakes sharper. When the movie talks about children being taken, you're not just thinking of abstract innocence lost, you're thinking of specific habits, specific laughs, specific tantrums that someone has learned to handle over years of caregiving. Emotionally, that hit me in a weirdly personal way. There's a fleeting shot early on of Wang Wei trying to braid his daughter's hair, failing pretty badly, and both of them laughing as she corrects him. It's a tiny moment, but it anchored every frantic search image that followed in my head, because I couldn't stop thinking, that's who he's picturing when he's bashing someone's head into a table. He's not thinking in broad strokes. He's thinking about that lopsided braid, about shoes left in the wrong place, about the exact way she leans against him when she's tired. The movie trusts you to fill in that emotional detail without hammering you with constant flashbacks. Now, because I don't want this to sound like I'm blindly worshipping the film, let me dig into a few areas where I think The Furious stumbles or at least doesn't live up to its own best instincts. One is the depiction of the trafficking network beyond its most immediately visible faces. We get enough to understand its scope and cold efficiency, but there are moments where it veers toward generic evil cartel territory. Yes, the mundanity of evil is a point, but a few of the lower-level antagonists feel a tad interchangeable. A bit more variety in motivation, fear, greed, desperation, would have enriched those confrontations. As it stands, some of those opponents are mostly human sandbags, there to absorb the protagonist's wrath rather than to reflect back anything particularly interesting about the system. Another area that could have been more nuanced is the film's treatment of law enforcement as a whole. We do get hints of good cops trapped in bad structures, of people who want to help but are constrained by bureaucracy and fear of reprisal. However, these hints are fleeting compared to the screen time given to outright corrupt or apathetic officers. I'm not saying the movie needs to play both sides in some artificial way. Corruption is real, and stories should be allowed to go hard at it, but given how smart the film is elsewhere, I wouldn't have minded a more sustained look at the rare officials who do try to resist and what happens to them. That could have added an extra layer of tragedy, not just institutions failing, but individuals being broken by those institutions as they try to do right. In terms of visual storytelling, there are one or two instances where the editing undercuts the emotional weight of a scene by jumping just a beat too early. A confrontation will end, a character will be left visibly shattered, and just as you're about to really sit in that brokenness, the film cuts to the next plot beat. It doesn't happen often, but when it does, you feel the missed opportunity. Given how confident Tanigaki is in letting other moments breathe, these few rushed cuts stand out. Musically, while I appreciate the restraint, I do think the score could have taken a few more risks. The recurring motifs are effective, but there's a slight sameness to some of the tension cues. A more daring composer might have played with dissonance or unexpected instrumentation to reflect the fractured mental states of the leads. That said, it's also possible that a bolder score would have pulled focus in a way that didn't serve the story, so I can see why they opted for something that mostly stays out of the way. You know what, though? For all these nitpicks, the thing I keep circling back to is how textured the emotional landscape feels. There's this scene late in the film where Wang Wei, who has been operating at a constant pitch of driven desperation, suddenly looks embarrassed. Not ashamed, which we've seen, but embarrassed, like a man caught in a moment of vulnerability that doesn't fit the tough, unbreakable father image he's been trying to inhabit. It happens fast, you might even miss it if you're not really watching his face, and it's not tied to one of the big, plot-heavy sequences. But for me, that was one of the most important beats. It's a reminder that underneath all the righteous fury, there's still this guy who's a little awkward, a little shy, someone who doesn't know how to carry this much attention and expectation. That's the side of him his daughter would recognize, and the film is smart enough to keep that version alive even when he's at his most dangerous. It's easy to cheer for an avenging angel. It's much more unsettling, and moving, to watch an ordinary, slightly self-conscious man trying to act like one and almost breaking himself in the process. Naveen gets his own version of that unmasking, though in his case it's less about embarrassment and more about a dawning realization of his own limitations. For most of the film, he's the one who seems to know how the world works. He understands systems, media narratives, legal loopholes. There's a scene where he's trying to pull strings using his contacts, and it fails in a very public, humiliating way. You can see this flicker of panic behind his eyes. If my understanding of this landscape is wrong, what do I have left to offer? That moment, more than any punch he throws or wound he suffers, is what transforms him from the smart sidekick into a fully realized co-lead in my eyes. And then there's the way the two men see each other by the end. They start the film gazing at each other with barely concealed skepticism. Who is this guy, and why is he in my way? Midway through, there's grudging respect tinged with frustration. By the time you hit that final stretch, they look at each other with something that's not quite friendship and not quite brotherhood, but definitely more than alliance. It's recognition. They recognize, in each other, the same haunted gaze they see in the mirror. That mutual recognition doesn't magically solve anything, it doesn't fix the world or heal their losses. But it means that, when they go back into that world, if they go back, they are no longer the only ones who've witnessed what they've become. And this is the part that snuck up on me emotionally. I went in expecting to care mainly about whether they succeeded in their immediate goals, rescue, revenge, exposure. I walked out caring more about whether they'd be able to look anyone they love in the eye again without flinching. That shift is, for me, the mark of a drama that's doing more than just pushing buttons. It's asking you to think beyond the final frame, beyond the credits, into how these fictional choices echo real ones in a world where violence often feels like the only language that power understands. There's still one corner of this film I haven't really dug into yet, though, and it's crucial to understanding why The Furious lingered with me the way it did: the texture of its world outside the violence, the way it captures work, home, and the spaces in between. One of the reasons The Furious doesn't dissolve the minute you turn the TV off is because the world around all that rage feels lived in. This isn't one of those movies where people only exist in abandoned warehouses and neon-lit alleys. You see where Wang Wei sleeps, where he eats, the cramped routines that make up his life before everything detonates. His apartment isn't the picturesque poor man chic you get in some films. It's cramped, a little cluttered, with that specific patina of objects that have been repaired instead of replaced. A chair that wobbles but has been shimmed with cardboard. A kettle that whistles a little too loudly. We don't get a long tour, but every time the camera lands there, you understand why this man's first instinct is to fix, to mend, to make do. It's who he is long before he picks up a weapon. His workshop might be my favorite set in the movie, even though nothing obviously spectacular happens there. It's just a small space, crowded with tools and half-finished jobs, but the way Tanigaki shoots it makes it feel sacred. Early on, you get these slow pans across his workbench, screws sorted into mismatched containers, a piece of sandpaper worn almost smooth, a radio that looks older than his kid. The light is warm and a little dusty, like the air is full of tiny, floating reminders of work done and work waiting. Later, when he returns to that space after the kidnapping, everything looks sharper, harsher. Same tools, same walls, but the color temperature feels colder, like someone turned down the global saturation on his life. That's the kind of visual storytelling that sneaks under your skin. What's interesting is how the film quietly links that workshop to the spaces of the cartel. Both are sites of labor, of repetitive tasks, of hands doing what they've done 1,000 times before. But while Wang Wei's space is cluttered with attempts to improve and repair, the cartel's stash houses and offices are tidy in this almost oppressive way. Stacks of identical boxes, clean desks, organized ledgers. The violence they oversee is invisible on the surfaces. It's the banality of evil rendered in interior design. When Wang Wei steps into those spaces, there's a subtle sense of inversion, his calloused, grease-marked hands against their sterile order. He doesn't fit, and the film never lets you forget that. Naveen floats between worlds in a different way. We see him in newsrooms or pseudo-newsrooms that have clearly been battered by budget cuts and disillusionment. There are monitors that flicker, chairs that don't match, walls with outdated posters about journalistic integrity curling at the edges. The vibe is less glamorous hotshot reporter, and more overworked local staff who know their limitations better than their bosses do. When Naveen's at home, a home we see less of, but enough, you feel a similar sense of in-between. It's not as cramped as Wang Wei's, but it's not luxurious either. There are traces of two lives interwoven, his things, his wife's, work spilled into domestic corners. A jacket on the back of a chair that hasn't moved in weeks. Coffee cups left on a windowsill like someone meant to come back to them and never did. The city itself is another character, but not in the overused, the city is a character way that usually means we showed some skyline shots. Here, it's about transition spaces, bus stops, corridors, stairwells, public bathrooms, the backs of small shops. Places where people pass through, not where they stay. That emphasis makes sense for a story about disappearance and displacement. When the camera stands at a crosswalk watching strangers flow past, you start to feel how easy it would be for someone to vanish into that stream without the city even noticing. Tanigaki doesn't romanticize the streets, they are not neon cool or sepia nostalgic. They are just there. Functional, worn, crowded, indifferent. There's a motif I really liked involving doors and thresholds. A lot of key scenes, violent and otherwise, happen either in doorways or immediately on the other side of them. You see characters hesitating with their hands on doorknobs, peering through cracks, pressing ears to panels. Sometimes the camera stays outside and we only hear what's happening in the next room, sometimes it slips inside and looks back out through the frame. Over and over, you're given this visual language of crossing points, the moment before you enter a room you might not leave, the decision to step into someone else's space and alter it forever. Given that the story revolves around people being dragged through doors they didn't choose, that's a smart, subtle choice. Even the way the Furious shows food tells you a lot about its world. Early on, meals are shared, however modest. Wang Wei and his daughter at a table, maybe not eating anything fancy, but there's a rhythm there, passing dishes, teasing comments, that choreography of familiarity you only get in close relationships. After the kidnapping, food becomes utilitarian. Instant noodles gulped down without tasting, plastic-wrapped sandwiches eaten standing up. Naveen in particular is always half-eating, half-working, his mouth moving around words and cheap carbs at the same time. The film isn't shouting, "Look how their lives have changed," but your body notices the shift. When these men stop tasting what they eat, you understand something fundamental has broken. That attention to everyday life makes the violence hit harder because it always feels like an intrusion, even when our leads are the ones initiating it. When a fight erupts in a cramped hallway of an apartment building, you're acutely aware of the families behind each of those closed doors, the kids doing homework at tables, the grandparents watching TV. There's a brief cutaway in one such scene where an older woman peers through her peephole, sees just enough chaos to realize what's happening, and then slowly backs away, hand over her mouth. She doesn't call the police. She doesn't scream. She just retreats into her own fragile bubble of safety, hoping it'll pass her by. That moment says more about the relationship between ordinary citizens and both crime and law enforcement than a dozen expositional speeches could. A big part of why that works is the casting of background faces. People look like they've actually been standing at bus stops for 20 years, like they've actually spent long days selling things in markets, like their shoes really do hurt. Extras aren't glamorous, they are puffy-eyed, hunched, distracted. There's a sense that everyone in this city is carrying something, stress, secrets, disappointments, and that the trafficking ring is just one particularly terrible expression of a much broader atmosphere of pressure. Even if you stripped away the central plot, you'd still believe in this place as somewhere people live, love, and slowly wear down. The film also has a quietly sharp eye for how space equals power. Look at where conversations happen. When Wang Wei goes to the police, he's usually standing, being made to wait, hovering at edges of desks. Cops sit. Supervisors have offices with doors they can close. The physical levels align with the power dynamics. Contrast that with scenes in the underworld, where hierarchy is enforced through proximity. Lower-level guys crowd around doors and stairwells, decision-makers sit in the middle of rooms with good sightlines. When Naveen tries to leverage his connections, the difference between having to stand in a noisy, shared workspace versus being invited into a private office says everything about how seriously he's being taken. These are small staging decisions, but they build up a coherent picture of how authority is embodied in this world. I found myself really tuned into how the film uses personal objects, too. We've talked about Wang Wei's tools, his daughter's belongings, Naveen's recorder. Beyond those, there are little details that keep reappearing. A cheap bracelet. A worn-out satchel. A pair of shoes. They don't become heavy-handed symbols, but they do anchor certain emotions. When you see the same object in very different contexts, happy domestic scene early on, then lying alone in a harsh interrogation room light later, it hits you right in the chest. We're not mourning abstractions like innocence or justice so much as the loss of very specific, tangible relationships. That specificity makes it all the more glaring when the film glosses over certain social spaces. One thing I missed a little was more sense of community beyond the immediate families. We get hints of neighbors and colleagues, but we rarely see, say, a group of parents talking about their fears, or a small business owner reacting to the news of increased disappearances. That absence might be intentional, a comment on isolation in urban life, but it also flattens the potential for collective response. We're so locked into the personal crusades of Wang Wei and Naveen that it's easy to forget there are entire neighborhoods quietly adjusting to the knowledge that children and women are not safe. A couple more scenes of wider community impact could have deepened the stakes even further. Let's talk about gender for a minute, because that's one area where the Furious is strong in some ways and limited in others. On the plus side, the missing women and children are not reduced to saintly, voiceless trophies. They are given personalities in the glimpses we do see. They have jobs, quirks, tempers, senses of humor. Naveen's wife, particularly, carries a kind of fearless professionalism in the few moments we're allowed with her, enough that you believe she would dig into a dangerous investigation by choice. However, the narrative still mostly positions them as off-screen catalysts rather than on-screen agents. Their choices and experiences during captivity, which could have been a powerful parallel narrative, remain largely implied. Now, the film clearly doesn't want to shift into becoming a misery-focused captivity drama, and I respect that boundary. But I do think there's a missed opportunity to show more of how women resist or endure in these networks beyond being rescued or not. Even a couple of short scenes of them supporting each other, gathering information, or making tiny acts of rebellion inside that horrific space would have added a lot. As it stands, the emotional weight is heavily skewed toward the fathers and husbands on the outside, which is understandable given the story's focus, but a tad traditional. On the other hand, the film does something quietly smart with the older women who orbit the story. Mothers, aunts, landladies. They are usually the ones keeping some semblance of routine going. They lay out meals, they nag about health, they smooth over social awkwardness. When things go wrong, they are often the first to intuit it, long before men say anything. An older woman watching Wang Wei leave in a hurry and just knowing, from the way he doesn't meet her eyes, that something terrible has happened. These women have no power in the systems of cops and criminals, but they carry an emotional authority. Without turning them into sages or martyrs, the movie gives them a presence that lingers. I have to admit, there's one tiny moment with an older neighbor that got to me almost more than some of the big set pieces. Wang Wei is returning home in the midst of the chaos, clearly exhausted and not fully present, and this woman stops him briefly in the hallway. She doesn't ask what's wrong, she just presses a small bundle of food into his hands and says something like, "You look thin." It's such a mundane, culturally familiar gesture, but the tenderness of it nearly broke me. He doesn't know how to accept the kindness in the state he's in. He sort of half smiles, half flinches. The camera doesn't linger long, but in that exchange you see what's at stake beyond the immediate rescue, the entire web of tiny, sustaining comforts that make life bearable. And since we're on the subject of what's at stake, it's worth looking at how The Furious situates itself in the broader landscape of revenge dramas. If you've seen films where a lone parent rampages through criminal underworlds to save a child, you might expect a certain rhythm, abduction, montage of training, preparation, a trail of increasingly important villains, a climactic confrontation with a mastermind, cathartic slaughter, tidy epilogue. This movie borrows pieces of that skeleton but keeps dislocating your expectations. The cartel doesn't have a single flamboyant mastermind, the antagonists are distributed. The preparation phase is mostly watching two exhausted men fail to sleep and fail to convince anyone to help. There are no cool, gearing up montages, no rock music sequences of weapons being loaded in sexy close-up. In fact, some of the most important turning points are deeply UN cinematic on the surface. Someone deciding to share a key piece of information not because they got beaten into it, but because they are just tired of being afraid. A lead that comes not from clever hacking or brilliant deduction, but from a minor paperwork error someone made months ago. These choices ground the narrative in a kind of stubborn realism. It's less, the chosen hero will set this right, and more, sometimes, the rot in a system is so pervasive that even its mistakes can be exploited if someone desperate enough is willing to follow through. This is where my slightly surprising take comes in. I don't actually see The Furious as an action movie with drama elements. I see it as a grief drama that happens to be punctuated by extremely painful action. That may sound like semantics, but it changes how you evaluate its choices. If you go in expecting primarily kinetic thrills, you might find the stretches of quiet anguish indulgent. If you see it as a character study of two men disintegrating under pressure, then every punch and kick reads less like spectacle and more like punctuation. The fights become the only language they have left when words fail. On a personal note, I'll admit I had to recalibrate my own expectations mid-watch. The director's history had me primed for a certain kind of tightly engineered combat showcase. At first, I caught myself waiting for the big one, that one knockout set piece you'll see shared in out-of-context clips online. But the film keeps refusing to serve up that kind of easily isolated, purely aesthetic moment. The best sequences are almost antiviral, they only work emotionally when you've sat through the numb bureaucracy, the dead-end leads, the long silences. Once I stopped chasing the high of a hypothetical, perfect fight scene, and settled into the story's grief rhythm, the whole thing clicked much harder. And yeah, okay, small cell phone, there was a point where I realized I had paused the movie not during a brutal showdown, but during a static shot of a hallway with peeling paint. I just wanted to look at it for a second. That's when you know a film's atmosphere has wormed into your brain. You're admiring the set dressing like it's a character. If that's not your idea of a good time, you may bounce off the film's moodier stretches, but if you like to marinate in texture, it's a quiet treat. Another layer that really snuck up on me is how The Furious deals with memory, not just in terms of flashbacks, which are used sparingly, but in the way physical spaces and sounds trigger recall. A particular ringtone that sends Wang Wei spiraling. A news broadcast in the background that makes Naveen unconsciously stiffen. The movie trusts you to notice these patterns without holding your hand, and by the time you're deep into the story, certain audio cues carry as much weight as visual ones. When you hear a child's voice echoing faintly from another room, you don't need to see anything to feel the protagonist's hearts drop. The editing of memory is also worth mentioning. Instead of long, explanatory flashback sequences, we get these tiny, almost fragmentary insert shots. A hand letting go of another in a crowd. A pair of shoes by a doorway. A piece of homework left unfinished on a table. They pop in and out quickly, often synced with a physical gesture in the present. Wang Wei reaches for a door handle in the cartel's world, and for half a second we see his daughter's hand on that same handle at home. It's not a big, here is the callback, moment, it's more like a synaptic misfire, the brain betraying him with images of what this place is replacing. That's exactly how trauma memory tends to work, intrusive, specific, and not always narratively tidy. If you've made it this deep into the movie, you're probably wondering by now whether all this emotional and thematic ambition actually sticks the landing. Without detailing the final beats, I'll say, the ending is not clean, but it feels honest to the mess that came before. Some viewers are absolutely going to feel shortchanged if they wanted either a full fairytale rescue or a nihilistic, everyone dies bloodbath. The Furious walks a narrow path between those extremes, offering partial victories, hard compromises, and a sense that whatever justice has been achieved is both too little and almost unimaginably costly. Personally, I respect that. In fact, I think making the last 20 minutes any neater would have betrayed everything the film had spent so much time establishing. If you spend 2 hours showing how deep the rot goes and how profoundly violent scars everyone involved, you can't just snap your fingers in the final reel and say, and then everything was okay. Even the most successful actions in that home stretch carry a bitter aftertaste. You get reminders that for every person affected by this one ring, there are countless others whose stories will never intersect with a Wang Wei or a Naveen, who will never have someone wreaking havoc on their behalf. So where does that leave us, as viewers? For me, it left me in that headspace I talked about at the very beginning, the heavy, quiet, slightly stunned space where you have to decide what to do with what you've just seen. I found myself thinking less about the logistics of the plot and more about the emotional residues it left behind. The image of a man washing blood off his hands in a cheap sink. The sound of a journalist's recorder clicking on in a room that suddenly feels way too small. The sight of a child's room that still looks lived in even though its occupant hasn't been home in days. Now, stepping back from the intensity of the experience, let me finally give you something that resembles an answer. Is The Furious worth your time, and who is it actually for? If you're someone who wants clean, triumphant revenge, this might not scratch the itch you think it will. It's too knotted, too interested in the psychic fallout. But if you're drawn to dramas that sit in moral grey zones, that let their characters be wrong and ugly and still worthy of care, this is absolutely a film you should carve out space for. The performances alone justify the watch. Xie gives a layered, deeply human portrait of a man who slowly realizes that the strength he thought would save his family might be the thing that destroys him. Taslim brings a bruised intelligence to Naveen, making him more than a walking exposition machine or a generic sidekick. He's a co-protagonist with his own arc, his own breaking points. Enyou doesn't get as much screen time, but the chill of his presence lingers in the spaces his character has touched. Even the supporting players, from exhausted cops to oblivious bureaucrats, feel like people whose lives extend beyond the edges of the frame. On a craft level, Kenji Tanigaki proves he can handle not just the geometry of bodies in motion but the geometry of grief, how it expands, contracts, warps relationships. The choreography is brutal and grounded, the camera work patient where it counts and kinetic where it needs to be, the sound design finely tuned to amplify tension without overwhelming it. The script, by Tin Shu Mak, Chilong Lei, and Kwon Sin Shum, occasionally reaches for a cliché line or leans a little too hard on implication over exploration, but more often than not, it hits a tough, unsentimental register that feels earned. Would I recommend it lightly? No. The subject matter is heavy, and the film doesn't cushion the blows much, even when it holds back from the most graphic possibilities. If stories about trafficking, police corruption, and familial loss are triggering for you, this might be something to approach with caution or skip altogether. The Furious asks a lot of its audience emotionally. It's not the kind of thing you throw on as background noise while you scroll your phone. But if you're in a headspace where you can handle being put through the ringer a bit, I think there's real value in what this film is doing. It's not just wringing you out for sport. It's forcing you to sit with uncomfortable questions about what justice means in systems designed to commodify human bodies, about what's left of a person after they've spent all their love as ammunition, about how we, as bystanders, consume stories of suffering. Watching it, I found myself weirdly grateful that it didn't make me feel good. It made me feel a lot, but not good, and that's an important distinction. On a more practical note, if you're a fan of character-driven action like some of the grimmer Korean revenge films, or if you appreciate when genre stories are willing to slow down and actually care about their protagonists' interior lives, The Furious is squarely in your lane. If you're someone who usually bounces off action because it feels empty, this might actually be a good entry point. Just be aware that the action here is designed to bruise, not to dazzle. For newcomers to this kind of cinema, I'd say, give yourself space for it. Don't watch it when you're half asleep or multitasking. It rewards attention, not because it's convoluted, but because so much of what it's doing lives in the spaces between the obvious beats. Let the quiet scenes land. Let yourself be annoyed when the plot hits dead ends. That annoyance is part of the emotional mosaic. Allow the film to make you complicit in wanting violence and then unsettled when it gives it to you. And if you're the sort of viewer who likes to pick apart craft after the credits roll, there's plenty to chew on. You can trace how the color palette mirrors the characters' psychological states, how the blocking of scenes maps power dynamics, how the recurring sound motifs train you to anticipate danger or grief. You could easily spend a second watch just tracking where the camera chooses to be in each scene and why. That's the kind of depth that distinguishes something you watch once and forget from something that quietly digs a trench in your memory. Ultimately, what keeps circling in my head is not a single line of dialogue or a specific plot twist, but a feeling, that sense of watching someone's humanity get stretched thin, almost to breaking, and rooting for them not just to achieve their objective, but to survive themselves. The Furious understands that the real stakes of vengeance aren't just whether you can punish the guilty, it's whether you can live with the part of you that was willing to become someone else to do it. If that sounds like the kind of story you want to wrestle with, then yeah, make time for this one. It's not perfect, few films that aim this high are, but it's honest in its ugliness, generous in its small mercies, and anchored by performances that feel like they were carved out of something heavy and real. And if you've already seen it and you're still here, sitting in that weird post-movie quiet with me, I'm curious how it hit you. Did you find the ending satisfying or maddening? Did you read it as a bleak warning against revenge or as a bruised affirmation that sometimes fury is all we have left? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to hear where you landed with it, because this is one of those movies that lives a second life in discussion. I'm going to wrap it up there before I start replaying the whole thing beat by beat, because honestly, I could. The Furious isn't the kind of film you just tick off a list, it's one you carry around for a bit, whether you like it or not. If you got something out of this long ramble and you like diving deep into dramas that punch holes in your chest, feel free to stick around and hit subscribe to Bongo Gaming. We do a lot of this here, picking stories apart and seeing what's left in our hands. Take care of yourselves, hold your people close, and maybe, just maybe, let a few things go before they turn you into someone you don't recognize. I'll see you in the next one.